headlining speaker is professor of anthropology and anatomy at Idaho State University in Pocatello, Idaho. So he's a long way from home. Anyway, he's also the author of Legend Meets Science, one of the definitive books of on Sasquatch. And I bought one last year, the Sasquatch field guide that he made. It's really awesome. How about a big hand for Dr. Jeff Meldrum?
All right. Well, thank you for your patience and indulgence. And after a brief conference over here, we've decided that we're going to cancel dinner. He turns to me and says, "Can you wrap it up in an hour?" I don't think so. That was we'll fly through though at sonic speed. So go ahead, go and turn the lights. So it's a pleasure to be with you, to see such a great crowd, such a large crowd, to hear some really fantastic presentations, and a lot of information's been conveyed. I think Shelley did a fantastic job of setting the tone. My ear's still ringing after that introduction. I was too close to the speaker. Sets the tone for, in the vein of what I was trying to convey to those of you that were here last night, and that is to raise the bar, to really strive for the goal of functioning as citizen scientists, to collect reliable, objective, and critical data, to eliminate the more likely explanations for evidence or for artifacts or whatever you find before jumping to conclusions that it was left by this very rare, very elusive creature. So, but tonight, changing up the pace just a little bit, given the auspicious occasion of the opportunity to meet and associate with Bob Gimlin, and also the fact that it is the 51st anniversary, I'd like to share a presentation that I prepared for last year, but I was kind of surprised, given the significance, at least from my point of view, of that piece of photographic evidence. I was rather underwhelmed by the media attention that it received during that anniversary year. And that's one of the ploys that people now, these days, I find, the critics are often less vocal and rather simply ignore the evidence. And that's kind of what happened. So I've pressed forward in this second year, especially in those venues where I haven't spoken in the previous year, to continue beating this drum on the significance of the Patterson film. Because 51 years later, you may ask, well, why are we still talking about this? It is a very significant piece of evidence, and the theme that I want to address this afternoon is that it actually anticipates by decades our current conventional wisdom in anthropology in many ways. So there's going to be a little bit of technical information, not so much, we're shifting gears from recounting stories and anecdotes about encounters and traditions in various regions of the world and so forth, and we're going to look long and hard at the Patterson Gimlin film and still really only scratch the surface. Now, if you haven't seen it, boy, that's a really, I'm sorry the quality of the projector isn't better, but that's a really grainy, chopped up representation of it. Doesn't do it justice. But that's by far, I can't say it. I was going to say, this is probably the best representation of the film that you've ever seen, but that's not true. But in any case, it's interesting that the version that is often seen by people on television is a licensed VHS copy, a tape that Mrs. Patterson provides to the networks when they want to license its appearance, and oftentimes it doesn't get depicted very much because of the rather exorbitant fee that her attorney demands for the use of that film, which is unfortunate because it's really limited the exposure and more in-depth treatment in the media of that piece of film. But it the version that she provides is a very poor copy. It's very scratched and grainy and faded, which adds to the mystique a bit. It has that kind of campy feeling, that nostalgic feeling of the sense that you might have had being on that sandbar on that fateful day, but it doesn't portray the quality of the data, the information that can be gleaned from that film as a result. Now, an interesting aside here as to the attention that the film has drawn of late. This is Dr. Ian Redmond, or actually he's not a doctor, but he's an OBE, which is the Order of the British Empire, just one notch below, as I understand it, below being knighted. He is, in recognition of his tremendous efforts in conservation work and so forth. But Ian Redmond is a primatologist who studied under Diane Fossey and continues, as I said, an active member of various conservation groups, and presently he's the editor of Primate Eye, which is the publication of the Primate Society of Great Britain, which is a much more extensive than the name would suggest. It's an international society of primatologists, which happened to be founded in the year 1967. And so for their 50th anniversary issue, Ian, who's a good friend, wrote the editorial, and he talked about the founding of the organization, its history, and so forth. But then he shared this. He said, in the same year that the PSGB was founded and Diane Fossey began her landmark study of the mountain gorillas, it so happened that a tall bipedal figure was filmed in Bluff Creek in Northern California. And he went on to say, to admonish his readers, despite repeated expert analysis over half a century, the PGF still defies efforts to dismiss it as a hoax. As scientists, of course, we should always be willing to examine the evidence. Each newly described species shows that. However unlikely the prospect of a new species might seem, improbable does not mean impossible. Now, I've asked him, he's been very busy and traveling a great deal. I asked him, what was the response? Did he get any feedback from his society members about this? And it went on. He talked at length about some of the different types of evidence, some of the publications, some of us scientists who have been on the forefront of investigating this, drew attention to the relic hominoid inquiry, of which he serves as a member of the editorial board. And so I was very curious to see what kind of feedback he has gotten, but haven't gotten feedback from him yet regarding feedback on his editorial. So, but mentioning the RHI, the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, this is an online, open access, peer-reviewed scholarly journal that I edit with the assistance of an editorial board of about 10 PhDs or other professionals of appropriate credentials. And we're in our 7th year of publication now, and have quite an assemblage of scholarly literature, research papers, essays, book reviews, lots of insightful and essay-style book reviews, not just, you know, the book is this long and has an index and whatever, but really talking about the points made in the book and the pros and cons of the conclusions drawn by the author and so forth. But also, in special reference to the Patterson Gimlin film, there are a number of very interesting, can that be focused at all, Daniel? Is it just my eyes, or is it really out of focus? It's just a wall, the irrigation, okay. All right, well that's too bad. And so I encourage you to go take a look. The address is pretty easy to remember. It's hosted on the ISU web server, so it's isu.edu/RHI for Relic Hominoid Inquiry. Okay. You overshot just a little bit. Go back just a smidge. That's pretty good there. Okay. So what is the significance of the film? Well, as I said, it remains the most compelling piece of photographic evidence. You know, there are lots of pretenders or lots of candidates for photographic evidence of varying qualities. But the Patterson Gimlin film set that bar so high that a lot of the heat generated in discussions and debates about the merits of others is really kind of misplaced. Because even if you, for many of these other films, even if you convince yourself or someone else that it is Sasquatch, the nature of the film is such that it really does not add much to the debate when we're still debating and discussing the merits of the Patterson Gimlin film way up here. But it does also attest to the physicality of this entity. It doesn't disappear before your eyes. It doesn't suddenly transform into an orb of light or levitate or anything else unusual, abiologic. It left footprints across that sandbar, which can be witnessed in the film and were documented extensively afterward. It provides a baseline from which to establish the scientific context of just what Sasquatch is. What do we see there? And what is the significance of its features, its anatomy, and its apparent behaviors? And most importantly, the theme I want to stress today is that it anticipates current conventional wisdom in anthropology. By anticipate, I mean it portrays things that were absolutely unorthodox and contrary to the prevailing thinking in anthropology in 1967. That was a problem for both Roger and Bob, but also for those who were tasked with the chore of evaluating it critically and objectively, without preconception. Now, my first encounter with this film occurred at its, what I understand to be its premiere showing at the Spokane Coliseum in 1968. And I was a young lad in about 5th grade, about 10 or 11 years old. And I remember we were at school for an evening program to put on a show for our parents. It was a gym show, and while we were in the classroom waiting for our turn to go out onto the floor, the kids were talking, my classmates were talking about this movie that was coming to town about Bigfoot. The advertisement was in the paper that morning, apparently. I'd missed it. Not that I read the paper every morning as a 5th grader, but it hadn't been brought to my attention. But they were talking about this, and I was fascinated. I'd never heard of Bigfoot before that, the notion of Bigfoot, but at that age was interested in dinosaurs and everything prehistoric and everything mysterious and cavemen and so forth. And so I was quite intrigued. I remember running home. It was after dark. And it was about 3 or 4 blocks, but to get across the schoolyard in amongst these gigantic ponderosa pine trees that someone was describing earlier, there was a Bigfoot behind every one of those tree trunks as I ran home. But I opened up the paper and there was the advertisement. And I actually have a copy of that advertisement someone sent to me after describing this one time. So I got to meet indirectly, or at least not personally, but to meet or see Roger Patterson come out on stage and introduce that. I was able to convince my dad to take my younger brother and me, and we were in the 3rd row of the Spokane Coliseum for one of those showings. Now, it's interesting because upon departing, I picked up their informational newsletter, which invited you to join the Northwest Research Association, which Roger had created in order to sell memberships and presumably generate a revenue stream so that he could go out in the field on a regular basis and search. And one of the benefits, obviously the informational packet introduced his previously published book, which there's my very dog-eared plastic covered copy of that I read and reread. But membership also got you a 5x7 color print from the film, an 11x14 black and white full frame print, which still hangs in my office, and you could also purchase separately replica casts. This one from 1964 or 63, if you ask for Cliff Barrickman. There's some controversy or contradictory notations regarding it, but it was from Bluff Creek. This is probably the male, probably the beau of Patty. Now it's interesting because I've described this at a number of venues. Is there anyone in this room that was a member of the Northwest Research Association and had any of these perks? I think I'm the only member, the one and only member of the society. I've only counted, well, I know of one other. A gentleman sent me a manila envelope and he said, I bought this at an estate sale and I thought you might like it. And here was the introductory membership letter, certificate, and a couple of black and white prints of Roger holding the cast up that were autographed by Roger. And, but that's, as far as I know, that's the only other person. I believe I'm the only person that has one of the original replicas in white resin plastic of this footprint, this copy of the footprint, which is pictured in his book, by the way. But really interesting. I mean, I have had, as we talked about last night, the privilege and honor of becoming good friends with Bob and getting to know him and hearing the story directly from his mouth. And as I said, you can't spend 5 minutes with this gentleman and not be absolutely convinced that he's just the salt of the earth and an absolute straight shooter. So that's very important. Okay, before we proceed, I want to dispel a misnomer, one that has become sort of ingrained in the public psyche, that the Patterson film is blurry and indistinguishable. For those of you in the back, this says Bigfoot family portrait. The photographer here with the Bigfoot family is saying, he's bemoaning, I can't get it, I don't get it. No matter how many photos I take, you keep coming out blurry and indistinguishable. The film is not blurry. There is some motion blur because of Roger running with the camera and gyrating with his steps as he ran across that uneven creek bed, but then thankfully he ran into the sandbar, which was about 3 feet tall above the creek, level of the creek, and that knocked him to his knees because he had this camera up to his eye with his other eye closed presumably, and he ran right into that and dropped him to his knees, and then he's holding very still as he gets the very classic sequence as it pans from stage left to stage right. The problem is that we're taking a 16 millimeter film frame and taking an object on that's only 1.8 millimeters tall and blowing it up. And so we have this issue of the grain of the film. Now, most people in this room, I wager, don't have any idea what I'm talking about when I say the grain of the film. In the digital age, we're talking about pixels, right? Discrete little packets of information, but they're all uniform size and shape, these little squares. And so if you take, this won't be nearly as dramatic given the quality of the projection here, but if you take an image, say offline, and you blow it up, it becomes pixelated, right? We say that. Well, in the old days, prior to digital photography, whoops, I pushed the wrong thing. Did I turn it off? There we go. Okay. In the pre-digital age, film, we had film. And it was a sheet of plastic that was coated with an emulsion. That emulsion consisted of photosensitive chemical crystals, which when exposed to light would change their configuration and capture the color, the frequency, essentially, affected by the frequency of the light that struck them. And you can see the difference somewhat. You can appreciate it here. So here's, presumably, this is just representing a photographic image of that full frame. But this is a high definition scan. We're converting back to pixels in a way, but a high definition scan of the projected print on photographic paper that I have, that 5x7, which is remarkably clear, absolutely clear. Now remember, the camera he was using had a fixed focal length lens. That meant that he didn't have to manually focus it. Anything from 2 feet to infinity would be in focus. But when you enlarge a small object excessively, you reach the limits of the film grain and it becomes grainy. You can actually see the individual crystals basically, and what it's talking about, as opposed to pixels. But the same, in general, same principle. But this just shows how remarkably clear that is. Now, you know, one of my colleagues, Dr. David Daglin, who's a very vocal critic of all things Sasquatch, has written a book, Bigfoot Exposed, I think it was called. Very, very poor scholarly. I don't mean to be negative. I don't like to criticize people in public, but in this case it warrants it. I couldn't get through that book. There wasn't a single page that wasn't some misstatement or some misrepresentation of fact in it, and it was really, really bad. But he made the comment, has made it repeatedly publicly, that the film's basically worthless as a piece of evidence. It's so indistinguishable, you can't even recognize any facial features on the film subject. Well, I beg to differ. Obviously, he was working with very poor quality copies of the film to carry out his quote-unquote definitive analysis of this. But I mean, you know, it doesn't take much to practice or expertise to look at this and see the heavy brow ridge, the deeply shadowed eyes, the highlights on the cheekbone there, the shadow of the tremendously thick masseter muscle. You can see the highlight on the shiny, smooth skin of the nose. Maybe a little unclear whether there are nostrils downturned or forward directed, or shadows of a downturned nose. Oh. You're trying to bribe me to talk faster? Is that what you're doing? Okay. You can see the sort of puffed upper lip, like it's, you know, if you've ever seen a pensive-looking chimp when they tense their upper lip and it bulges out, and indication of the slit there of the mouth, the opening of the mouth, the receding jaw, the very deep, deep jaws altogether. Maybe the suggestion here of sort of irregularity in the hair for an ear somewhere in there, right there maybe. I mean, you know, some of the critics, there was a book by Joe Nichols, who writes for Skeptical Inquirer, who actually commented that this white area was obviously a cutout in the mask so that the actor could see out through it. Okay, so those kind of things. Well, you know, there's the scan of that full 5x7 color print that I have, and I often wondered, well, if that remarkably clear print was fabricated, why weren't there more frames from that film? Let me slide this over so I'm not standing in front of you, and if I'm blocking your view, just yell out. Oh, we can't do that, or we'll get feedback. Okay, there we go. Well, there were others. They just kind of languished for some time in a locked safe, apparently, that, so the story goes. Chris Murphy tells the story in one of his bits and pieces, little items that he posts on Sasquatch Chronicles, is it? Or no, Sasquatch Canada, Canadian Sasquatch. Excellent source of information. Chris has been a great historian of Sasquatch lore and so forth, and research. And so he's actually has published these. He provided these. It's not going to work. Get feedback. Can you see past me? Okay. So here's some examples. Again, you can't really quite appreciate it given the quality of this, but I just want you so you can see the well, a couple of things. I mean, look at the foot. Now notice how blown out it looks. You know, what's his name? Hieronymus talked about the false feet looking like big Kmart slippers. Well, that's why he's looking at something like this, you know. But that's just simply because when that smooth undersurface, that sole of the foot is directed right at the light, it's overexposed. And when something is overexposed, it has kind of a halo around it, which gives it a false boundary. And if you looked back at the other one, see there you can see at the angle that the foot outline is much more defined. And we'll look at a blow up at that, in fact, that even will convince you of that even more. But notice the forward set of the head on these shoulders with the very large trapezius muscle coming way up high on the back of the head. Look how long those arms are. The well-developed gluteals. You know, it's not clear whether there's a lot of fat deposit on there as well, or if that's just one large gluteal muscle for powerful extension of that leg as an adaptation for climbing a very steep terrain. There you can see the brow ridge way out there, the straight face, very large hands. Look how flat that face is. There you can see the indication of the ear quite clearly. Look at the sloping forehead. Well, there is no forehead. The sloping brow. There's no vertical forehead at all. I mean, it goes straight from the brow at an angle back up, and it's not clear how much of this is hair versus musculature on the cranium. But look at the depth. We'll talk about this especially, the depth of that trapezius muscle there. You can see actually too where the thumb, let me go back one, right there. See the line right there that corresponds to where the hand swings. And so that thumb or those fingertips have kind of worn the hair off a little bit from the side of the leg there where they've constantly brushed. Of course, it's a female, as evidenced by the presence of breasts. Some of it, we've been talking to some of you about the possibility of infrasound, and if she has the plumbing that we often find in great apes, these extralaryngeal air sacs that act as a reservoir of air that can be forced out through the vocal, either over the vocal cords or above through the pharynx, or act as resonating chambers during the production of low frequency vocalizations. But this puffy area right under her chin may indicate the presence of some of those air sacs, which are found in orangutans, gorillas, to a lesser degree chimpanzees, and even occasionally in humans. More of the same there. Okay, how many of you have seen this picture, this fold out? You know, back in the days before the internet, when you actually had to go to a library to look up, you know, check out a book or look in an encyclopedia set, this was the go-to reference in the Time, Life, Nature Library series for human evolution back in the 60s. And it was graced by this big fold out here, and it depicted some of the ancestors, the fossil ancestors on the human lineage. Now, because of the fact that it was this fold out, it was, and the layout was constrained in this linear array, it gives the impression of the single file procession, with one species giving rise to the next, being replaced by it into the next. Now, admittedly, to the author's and editor's credit, they do show the species with tremendous amount of overlap here, but still, either consciously or unconsciously, it has that remarkable effect on the way that we conceive of evolution. And it's become a meme. It really has, because you've seen it in all different kinds of iterations, okay? So, you know, I can relate to that. Boy, I tell you, when I put my reading glasses on, the sweet spot is not very far from the screen, and I find myself all bent over like that. The homage to our extraterrestrial visitors, Homer sapiens. How many of you are Monty Python fans? Ministry of Unusual Gifts, Unusual Walks. And then this, I was at my parents' home. My number 2 son, his family just moved to that same town in Boise, and we were all together one evening for a visit. And during the course of the evening, at one point I looked up, and here's my son and his wife, both with their faces in their devices. Something's wrong with this picture. Anyway, well, the point of this is, this perception fed right into a concept that had taken root in anthropology. It was borrowed originally from microbiology. Back in the 30s, a Russian microbiologist had noted that if you grew, for example, the classic textbook example was 2 species of paramecium, little single-celled microorganism. If you grew one species in a particular medium of bacteria, they fed on bacteria, the species thrived. If you grew the second species, species B, in that same medium, it also thrived. But if you combined the 2 in the same petri dish, one of them thrived while driving the other to extinction, outcompeting it for the resources. So he called this the competitive exclusion principle. That became central to the new discipline of ecology, in the new discipline of ecology, to the niche definition. What a species niche was, and only one species could occupy the same niche at any given time. one competitor would go extinct, or there would be character displacement. They would have to evolve some other strategy in order to partition those resources somehow. Anthropology, in efforts to become more interdisciplinary, borrowed that notion, that niche notion, and they said, well, the hominin niche, our immediate ancestors, close relatives, is very particular, very exclusive, and defined broadly by walking on two legs, increased brain size, and above all, the possession of material culture, tool use especially, but then subsequently art and other aspects of culture. This became known in anthropology as the single species hypothesis, and was in its heyday during the 60s and early 70s. Okay? Now these dates are important. I'm not being esoteric here, but these are important. Why? Because it influenced the audience, the arbiters, the gatekeepers who evaluated the Patterson Gimlin film. Here's one example. Dr. Biegert was a prominent primatologist and anthropologist at he directed the Zurich University Institute of Anthropology, and he was here responding actually to the Minnesota Iceman, but it's reflective of the general attitude. Notice this: the thesis to which Neanderthal creatures, one suggestion for the identity of the Iceman, that Neanderthal creatures might still be living among us, is absolute nonsense. Whatever supposed proofs might be put forward. Now think about that. It's nonsense. It doesn't, whatever evidence or proofs you think you have. Today, and why is it nonsense? Because of this preconception. Today, on the earth, there lives only one species of hominid, modern Homo sapiens. So notice the date, that's 1969. Well, so when Roger goes before the academic community with his film and his footprints, what does he encounter? He encounters this, he encounters this virtually unassailable facade that represents the existing paradigm of science then, which embodies the single, in anthropology, the single species hypothesis. These critics weren't evaluating the film on its merits. They were evaluating the film against their preconception about what could or could not be. And so it can't exist, therefore it must be a hoax. You know? All right, well, paradigm, what does that mean? That's not a word we use very often, but in science it means a set of concepts and practices that define a scientific discipline at any particular time. Now notice especially the highlighted words, concepts. Shared preconceptions made prior to and conditioning the collection of evidence. The preconditions actually, or preconceptions actually affect and influence not only what you look for, but how you perceive what you find. These preconceptions embody hidden assumptions. There can be only one species of Homo sapiens on the earth, therefore everything is nonsense. That preconception conditioned instead of saying, you know, this, you know, let's not, I don't have enough time to go into all that. Okay, I'm sorry. All right, straying from my script just a little bit. I can't do that, or otherwise. All right, so it's been said that a telling test of a hypothesis is if it stands at odds with current conventional wisdom. Now, not to say that the only good hypotheses are ones that fly in the face of current knowledge, but if a hypothesis based on observation and evidence seems to run counter at this time, we shouldn't evaluate it on the preconceptions, but we should evaluate it on its own evidence. So one question we could ask, does it anticipate future knowledge? You know, maybe you have to sit on that hypothesis for a while. But eventually, some more information will come forward that further corroborates your hypothesis and overturns existing paradigms. At the time, in 1967, ideas about what it was to be a great ape, you know, were largely based on captivity, studies in captivity. Jane Goodall's studies were underway, Diane Fossey's were just commencing. We didn't know really anything about orangutans in the wild yet. So it was a very, very narrow perception of what these were. Likewise, the hominin fossil record, it didn't enter its golden era until the 70s. So our ideas about human evolution were also very constrained. Notions about the pattern and process of the emergence of characteristics that distinguish us from other primates was just in its infancy. And so this creature just was a real odd man out. It didn't fit any of the preconceptions about either of those two categories. All right, so the Patterson Gimlin film anticipated current anthropological understanding of hominins in a number of ways. And here are just a few examples, and we're going to kind of fly through some of these, but we'll have to do it pretty quickly. So let's first take that first one, a mosaic of small brain and bipedalism. In other words, the combination of a little brain with a more human-like adaptation for walking around on two legs. And there was a long-standing debate preceding this that started back in the 1800s about which came first, kind of a chicken or an egg type of an argument. Big brains or walking on two legs? Did we learn to walk on two legs, which freed our hands so that we could start to manipulate our environment in different ways and discover tools which fed back and selected for more brain enlargement? Or did we evolve bigger brains for whatever reason, our social interactions and structures and so forth, which then caused us to start manipulating our environment and use tools which prompted us to walk on two legs so that we could free our hands to better use those tools? You see, it's kind of a circular roundabout chasing its tail, but those were debates that raged. And so the idea that had the most consensus, the most support, was the one that obviously it was our brains that defined us. It was our intelligence that set us apart. And so this seemed to be at odds. Now here to exemplify this, turn to Dr. John Napier, who I have a great deal of respect for. He was, I mean, for a number of reasons. One, my area of discipline, primate locomotion, he was one of the fathers of. He was responsible, he and his wife, Prue, were responsible for sort of categorizing locomotor adaptations. So I, my graduate years spent a lot of time studying his writings and research on that. He also won my respect when he was one of the very few scientists who went out on a limb and actually wrote an objective treatment and assessment of this evidence. But again, it was influenced by the paradigm. It was constrained to a large degree by the paradigm. His book came out in 1973. Now, interestingly, John Napier, at the time, in 1967, was one of those few scientists in the US to be amongst the group that initially viewed the film and evaluated it. He was the director of the primate program at the Smithsonian between 1967 and 1969. So he talks about that in his book. He said that, before I read that, he said that it had to be a hoax, essentially. But he couldn't put his finger on any one particular thing that conclusively demonstrated that it was a hoax. You see the influence of the conditioning? It had to be a hoax, but I can't tell you why it had to be a hoax. Well, one thing though, he did say, he says the upper half of the body bears some resemblance to an ape, and the lower half is typically human. It is almost impossible to conceive that such structural hybrids could exist in nature. One half of the animal must be artificial, and therefore the whole thing would obviously be a hoax, right? So here was his problem. He looks at this thing, and it's just, you can't have those combinations. It's inconceivable, right? Inconceivable. Who does that remind you of? Yeah. So I feel like, Indigo Montoya here talking to Sandini, inconceivable. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. If he had waited one more year to publish his book, he would have witnessed the discovery of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. And how was she described in the popular press? Isn't this interesting? From the waist up, she looks just like a chimpanzee. From the waist down, she looks like a human. Well, no, wait a minute. Just a year ago, that was the basis for John Napier rejecting the Patterson Gimlin film. That very combination of traits. which all of a sudden are part of conventional wisdom in anthropology. Okay? So when we look at the Patterson Gimlin film now, it is exactly how we now conceive early Australopithecines, early hominin ancestors. These, what were essentially bipedal apes. They had a brain that was maybe 50 centimeters, cubic centimeters bigger than a chimpanzee or a gorilla. But they walked on two legs, and quite successfully, because that adaptation persisted. And that combination of small brain and bipedalism was a stable adaptation for several million years. All right, now, occasionally, well, we just saw that's an example of a paradigm shift. Paradigm shift, and this was a term that was coined by Thomas Kuhn, who wrote this very influential book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And that was back in the 60s already. They're thinking about this. A fundamental change in the basic assumptions and methodologies of a scientific discipline. To see the same information in an entirely different way. To illustrate that, he included this figure in his book. Now, how many of you looking at that see a warm, fuzzy bunny rabbit? See, it's interesting. It's interesting. There's a few. I wonder how that correlates with past experiences. How many of you see a bird? Yeah, that's by far the most common. But now that I've said it, how many of you can see a bunny rabbit? Okay, so your initial interpretation was influenced by my mere suggestion that it could be something else. You're seeing the exact same information in a different way. Well, that paradigm shifted from the 60s, from the single species hypothesis, this inexorable single file march from one species to the next, to a bush. To a bushy family tree with multiple parallel branches, multiple species coexisting across the landscape, and many of those branches persisting right alongside Homo sapiens until remarkably recent past. Now, the discovery of Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, should have really driven this message home. And it did sort of, but paradigms are difficult to completely overturn. And Kuhn warned that back in the 60s. He says sometimes it takes an entire generation to turn over before a new idea can take root. And this was what last night I was talking about. I mentioned that thinking about this, as we were reflecting upon the passing of some of the old guard of academics who have gone out there on the limb, like Dr. Bindernagel and Dr. Swindler and others. As we reflect on their passing, I was saying, how long is it going to be before another generation of young academics who are perhaps more, a little more cautious than I was as a young academic, a little less naive perhaps, or a little less idealistic about the nature of politics and science. And I said it could be a decade and a half before that changes. And so what's going to happen in that transition period? I keep looking around. I really sensed in Dr. Grover Krantz a remarkable sense of relief and gratification at my willingness to step up and take the baton from his hand in a very timely fashion. And it was uncanny, and maybe that will happen again. I keep looking around, at young academics. I had a real gratifying, one little digression here. Recently we had hired an adjunct, or a visiting assistant professor for a temporary position in anthropology. And she needed access to our cadavers, our donors in our anatomy suite for some of the research she was doing. She came over, was visiting with me and getting acquainted and asking about that and the possibilities and whatever, blah, blah, blah. And the conversation came to a lull, and she looked at me and she said, "Can I ask a geeky question?" I said, "Well, sure." This is a young academic who just graduated from a very prominent program. She's a forensic anthropologist and has her PhD and raring to go and doing research published and so forth. She reaches in her bag by the side of her and pulls out Sasquatch, Leisure Meets Science. Would you autograph my book for me? And it wasn't, there was none of this, and I wasn't patting myself on the shoulder, but it was so gratifying because here was a young academic who wasn't constrained, at least intellectually, by the pre-existing paradigms, by the preconceptions. Now she's going to be, as we discussed, she's going to be constrained. I guess we didn't discuss, this was online, we had this discussion. And I made the point that these young academics, even though they're interested now, they're essentially gagged and hobbled because the gatekeepers, those who will be overseeing their promotion and tenure, are still laboring under the preconceptions. Even though they would never admit that they are so influenced by an idea, a notion, a paradigm that existed back in the 60s and 70s, they are. They don't realize it, but that's the main reason they're having so much trouble accepting the notion that there could be another species out there, another bipedal primate, bipedal hominin. Okay, here's an example from 2007 that was printed in Newsweek that shows the bushiness of the tree, that shows the recent persistence of many of these species up to the present. There's Homo erectus, there's Homo heidelbergensis, and that should be pushed up further. Unfortunately, some of these most recent specimens haven't been fully published and described in the literature yet, but I was privileged to examine one specimen that was less than 20,000 years old, found just outside of. So imagine that. This is Homo heidelbergensis, big hulking thing with this heavy, heavy skeleton. I mean, it would look like a big, an NFL linebacker on steroids to the 10th degree. Big, muscular, heavily browed, big jaws. The differences are really quite intriguing. But living right alongside Homo sapiens up until 20,000 years ago, as far as we know in the fossil record. Why not more recently? Given all of the... And the point is, this is already obsolete 11 years later. We'd have to add at least these additional species to that figure in order for it to be complete. All right, so here's Professor Graybeard now, 50 years later, before the anthropological community, and unfortunately, again, it's washed out. You can't see it. The blue didn't come through, but there's an opening here. There's a void here. And so the point being, now what I call relic hominoids, and I want everyone to practice that. Say that for me. Relic hominoids. Okay. Practice that so that it rolls off your tongue just as easily as anything. Bigfoot is so laden with baggage and the stigma of the tabloid. Sasquatch, even though I prefer it, and it gives deference to the Native American traditions that preceded the more recent iterations, it still has become almost overused and sensationalized. But relic, I can talk to my colleagues about the possibility of relic hominoids. And so it may seem a little bit cumbersome, it may seem a little bit, highbrow or technical, but it's important. It really is. And I think the more that I'm very happy to see it used more and more frequently and with more and more familiarity and comfort. But the point is, with our expanding knowledge in the fields of anthropology and evolution and such, it has framed a space that now accommodates the Patterson Gimlin film. Before, there was no accommodation. There was no place for context. And so it was rejected outright. Now, the possibility is very real. No informed anthropologist can say it's impossible for such a creature to exist. Can't do it. If they do, they reveal their own ignorance, literally. I mean, ignorance not in the sense of being rude, but in the lack of knowledge. They don't have the understanding necessary to have an informed opinion. The question is the probability then. What is the probability that such a species has persisted? What is the probability that this evidence that is accumulating really points to the existence of an unrecognized hominin? All right, so let's go on. The retention, retention of the midfoot flexibility with a non-divergent hallux. Many of my critics have argued that the only reason to have a non-divergent hallux, a big toe that's in line with the other toes, is so that it can be incorporated into the longitudinal arch. And so the idea that there's a creature out there that walks on two legs that has flat, flexible feet just doesn't make any sense. Well, not so, I argue. So if we look at the footprints, here's the right and the left taken by Roger at the film site. And I'm going to put Bob on the spot, and I've read some things about this, but there's been this big argument that this is actually a dramatized scene that was choreographed and filmed after the fact, somewhere other than the Bluff Creek film site. Bob, do you have any recollection of holding the camera and taking this picture of Roger holding the casts up against the tree there? Is he with us? I'm really going to put him on the spot, aren't I? He might not be able to hear me. Bob, do you remember holding the camera and taking this picture of Roger up against the tree after he'd made the 2 footprint casts? You don't remember that? Okay. Well, Chris Murphy did a really good analysis where he was actually, by using other shots from the film, looking at other frames of the film showing Patty, identifying this actual tree trunk in the background, and it's not very far from where Patty crossed and where the tracks were almost certainly, these clear tracks were almost certainly cast. Anyway, there's in my mind, there's no question, even though some continue to raise the objection, that the footprints that were cast by Roger and Bob on that film site were made by whatever this is. I mean, if you take that foot and blow it up, I mean, again, look at the resolution that you can see. You can see toe stems, you can see the pads, you can see even this little indentation in the foot right there that marks the head and the base of that first metatarsal bone, and a suggestion of a flexion crease right across the foot there. That's important. Now, I'm so confident in the veracity of these footprints. If all I had were the footprints, I'd be convinced that the film was authentic, just based on their consistent morphology and the model that they portray. But I'm so convinced, I actually went out on a limb after I discussed this with a number of colleagues. There's a whole discipline called ichnology, which is the study of fossilized tracks and traces. Actually, not just fossilized, but because that same term is used in many forensic settings. But there is a discipline that focuses on fossilized tracks and traces. And basically, it's intended to allow a name to be attached to fossilized footprints for whom the remains of the track maker have not yet been discovered. So there's a name and, more importantly, a diagnosis, a description of the definitive, distinctive features that differentiate that footprint from others. And so I floated the notion, there have been different suggestions by people in various publications. Even Dr. Krantz had suggested that perhaps we would be justified on the basis of the footprints to name the Sasquatch. Well, he was wrong. There is no justification for that. It was totally unacceptable. But if he had instead named, according to the conventions of ichnotaxonomy, the footprints, then that would at least been a first step, pardon the pun. So, again, like I said, I floated this notion. I was given encouragement by a number of very prominent scholars in this discipline. And it's not a huge discipline. I mean, you far outnumber, probably by 2 to 1, the researchers in this discipline. But there was a symposium held at New Mexico Museum of Natural History entitled Cenozoic Tracks and Traces. And it was filled with international representatives of this discipline, about 75 to 80 people. I presented the ichnotaxonomy of these footprints, using as the type the right and left cast by Roger and Bob on the day of the filming, and gave it a name, Anthropological borealis, which roughly translates to North American ape foot. Now, some people take exception to the notion of ape. If that's the case, you still, anthropoid means man-like. So the man-like footprints of North America, if that makes, that makes you feel more comfortable. And so as of 2007, but most importantly, there is a diagnosis that distinguishes the Sasquatch tracks, whoops, did it again, wrong one here, that distinguishes the Sasquatch tracks from human and from other non-human great apes. other hominoids. And for the sake of time, I won't go through all the details of that, but to the type was also referred the material collected by Bob Titmus 10 days later, who went to the site and had just enough material to barely cast 10 successive footprints, regardless of their quality. Unfortunately, he didn't number them, didn't take any measurements of the gait and so forth, but still a remarkable record. And this track in particular was very significant for me in formulating the model of the distinctive characteristics of the Sasquatch foot, which represents the mid-tarsal break. Now by break, I mean to flex, not to damage, but to flex, to fold. And that mid-tarsal break is represented by a pressure ridge. Here's the reconstruction. The human foot is characterized by a longitudinal arch. When the heel is elevated during the step, the entire foot is lifted and pivots as a rigid lever about the ball of the foot. The ball differentiated and the head of that bone specialized to take up the peak plantar pressure under the ball when we push off. The Sasquatch foot, on the other hand, has not evolved yet, the arch, but rather has a flat foot with a very flexible midfoot here through what's called the transverse tarsal joint, or the mid-tarsal joint. Actually, two joints between the ankle bone and the navicular, the bone immediately in front of it, and the heel bone, or calcaneus, and the cuboid in front of it. So that when the heel comes up, it comes up first, as weight is now transferred through the entire forefoot, here, and sometimes, if the substrate is compliant enough, plastic enough, material will be displaced because of the compression here into the heel, raised up as like a little pressure ridge or a speed bump across the foot. And you can actually see that happen right there. Now let me go to an enlargement of that. So if you watch, and it's really washed out, unfortunately, I apologize for that, but you can see the heel elevate, and at one point, the heel is vertical to the substrate, right up and down. Now, if that was a rigid prosthetic foot or a stiff arched foot, then the forefoot, 6 or 8 inches of it would have to be sticking straight down into the ground. But it's not. Now, before I leave this picture, go to some stills. I want to draw your attention out here because we'll make reference to it. Look at those toes. Can you see them pointing upward during the swing? And then they go down, they depress, they flex as they come into contact with the ground. Look at the length of that. It almost looks like a duck foot. They're so long. We'll come back to that. Now, here in the stills, you can kind of see it. Again, it's completely washed out, but there's the heel starting to come up. There's the heel segment vertical, absolutely perpendicular to the ground. Okay, so the foot's flexed. You can't quite see the rest because it's impressed into the ground, and there's a little irregularity in the substrate, obviously, on that uneven sandbar. But that shows the mid-tarsal break. So I'm absolutely convinced of that interpretation, because I can see it, I can watch it take place, as well as correlate it to all the aspects of the foot. When Roger made his casts, he chose the flattest, cleanest, crispest, clearest examples he could find there. And unfortunately, because they were so flattened, the reaction was that they look like they're carved out of wooden planks. There's no topography, there's no indication of peak plantar pressure beneath the heel or the ball of the foot, or no arch. But it's a remarkably clear, so that was a disadvantage, unfortunately. But it was remarkably clear, almost as if the foot was molded. I mean, again, the details, look at the toe stems, the outline of the pads. As I pointed out earlier, you can see the bulge, you can see a crease across here, just a slight evidence of a crease, which corresponds to the metatarsal phalangeal joints, the knuckles of the foot, if you will. And this bulge right here, absolutely, because it's perfectly consistent with a human foot, especially if someone has slightly flat feet, and they step out of the swimming pool onto the cement, there's that medial bulge, because the navicular, which in a healthy arched foot is up in the air, is pressed down and makes contact with the ground. But that marks the point of the navicular tuberosity here, which places quite certainly the transverse tarsal joint. And lo and behold, when you take this independently derived inferred skeleton and superimpose it over the footprint that shows the mid-tarsal pressure ridge, what do you get? That transverse tarsal joint is right in front of the pressure ridge, right where you would expect it to be. Now, in addition, if you look at the placement of the knuckles of the foot there, the metatarsal phalangeal joints, you know, one of the things that both Grover Krantz and René de Hinden were misguided on was Grover thought that the foot was arched, and being arched, but being very, very heavy, the toes would have been even shorter than human toes in order to resist the bending stresses that we experience during toe off. That's why our toes are so short compared to something like a chimpanzee, which has long curved toes, but they don't work good for pushing off. They're great for grasping, but not for pushing off. So Grover thought they had shorter toes. Likewise, René de Hinden, looking at this, saw just peas in a pod. He just saw the toe tips. Thought the toes were very, very short. You know, that here was where the metatarsal phalangeal joints would be. But no, this flexion crease, there we go. This flexion crease indicates the position. And when you look at that film, tell me if I'm wrong. Look at the proportion here. Look at the toes flexing upward. Boom. And you can't hardly appreciate it on this, I realize, because it's so washed out. But I don't know why that is doing that. But now, here's what's interesting. The flexion crease. Well, why in the world? You know, in other words, the sole pad is extended up under the toes to a greater degree than not. I shouldn't say than ours, because in some people it is. Likewise. Now, take for example my ex-wife. Yeah, please take her. She has very stubby looking toes, or did, you know, 10 years ago. I haven't seen them for quite some time, but short stubby toes, because her sole is quite substantial. I mean, she could walk out across the driveway to get the mail and walk over all kinds of grit and gravel and stuff on the driveway. Whereas if I went out there, I would have taken about 3 steps and collapsed in pain. But she also has extremely flexible toes. And when she wasn't thinking about it, if she was sitting at the dinner table or sitting at the couch barefoot, she can curl her toes completely under her foot. So it looks like 2 fists at the end of her ankles, you know? The strangest looking thing. But, and we would always tease her about it, but my boys have inherited that same flexibility, and they do the same thing. It's really fun to tease them about it. But so one evening, I'm sitting here on the floor, and she's on the couch, has her leg over my shoulder, and I'm you know, performing my husbandly right here or duty of rubbing her feet at the end of the day, you know. I'm happy to do it, but I'm getting bored with the movie, you know. It wasn't Capture My Attention, chick flick or something, I can't remember what it was, but my mind started to wander, and I'm massaging her foot, and all of a sudden I thought, and I looked at her foot, and I took her toes, and I bent them down, because I'd never seen the sole pad while her toes were flexed. And boom, as soon as I did that, a flexion crease right across the ball of her foot. Just like what I described for Patty. But when you go home and look at your birth certificate, if you have an inked footprint, chances are you have a flexion crease. We were all born with one. This primitive trait due to a much more flexible foot. But as you began to grow and you started to walk, that sole pad continues to fill in, and the connective tissue becomes more elaborate, and the ball of the foot differentiates, and it covers that over. But if you can, most people can't. I mean, that's not that common of a trait to be able to flex your toes that far, but if you can, just like the palm of your hand. If you flex your knuckles, you see the crease. I don't know if that's the lifeline that goes straight across there like that or what, but it's there. It corresponds to the knuckles, so your fingers are a little bit webbed. So some of the Sasquatch tracks are more webbed than others, and this was another thing. See, Rene de Hinden criticized a lot of the Blue Mountain tracks. He called them sausage toes, because they were these long toes, because they weren't webbed up as far. It's kind of a familial trait. The ones in Northern California, almost all of them tend to have that split ball, it was called by some investigators, a flexion crease across the ball of the foot. But it reflects also then the length of the toes. Okay, that's fascinating. You know, who would have thunk that, you know? All right, now another criticism was, well, gee whiz, if there's this pressure ridge in this track, which played such an important role, why aren't there more? You've got 10 tracks here, why don't they show pressure ridges as well? Well, we usually only look at them straight on, and if they're more subtle, we don't really notice them. But with the digital scans that I have here, that we actually went down, I took a technician with me down in equipment to the Willow Creek Museum, Willow Creek China Flats Museum, and we scanned the original casts made by Bob Titmus that were in that collection. So that's what these represent. When you turn them around, what do you see? They all almost, but that was just so flat, but even there you kind of see that flexion point. They all have the pressure ridge expressed to one degree or another. And it addresses another question that Grover kind of wrestled with. He was trying to explain why were some of these tracks so short. And he said, oh, well, there's always variation in foot length, you know, when you measure individual footprints in a trackway. It depends on slippage and raising and lowering of the arch, or the degree to which the heel is impressed. Well, yeah, but it's hard to deal with, you know, 1 inch to 2 inches of difference in length. But when you think about the way she walks, Patty walks with a very compliant gait, with bent knees and flexed limbs. She's not coming down with a distinctive heel strike. None of these show a real deep heel imprint. You know, that's one of the more dramatic examples, and that's nothing compared to if you went striding with a deliberate gait across the sandbar like she did. But when you walk like that, with that forward lean, you tend to land on the forepart of your foot. And so the impression of the heel is more variable. But the forefoot length is consistently represented all across there. You know, 50 years later, you know, I create that slide. All right, well, we could even go back to the famous track cast by Jerry Crew. And I hope you'll be able to see it from this. But obviously the news photo was used a very strong flash. In fact, in some of them, the flash, if you've seen some of the pictures, the flash actually whites out the lenses of his glasses, so you can see the strong shadow behind it. But that tends to make things look flatter. And I had the privilege of visiting with one of Jerry's boys, who's the custodian of the track now, and it's all cleaned up, and lo and behold, what do you see? There's the pressure ridge. So it's really consistent. What really nailed this for me was when I had the chance to go to China. And there I visited with a gentleman named Mr. Yuan, who had a remarkable experience, an encounter with a Yeren, the Chinese wild man, literally translates as wild man, the Yeren. And to make a long story short, he spied this thing, he thought it was a bear sunning itself, he yells at it, turns and looks at him with a flat face and ears on the side of its head, slips off the boulder, walks away on 2 legs. He was stunned, but he had the presence of mind to follow it, tracked it, found where it squatted to get a drink from a spring in the mud apparently, and as it rocked forward, it left 2 very clear footprints in the mud. He went back and got plaster, came and cast them. He was going to show them to me for this documentary. We were filming a Monster Quest episode. And they wouldn't let me see it ahead of time. They had to have the cameras rolling to get my initial reaction to it. But I had given him the paper, the published paper of the ichnotaxonomy of the Sasquatch footprints, and it had this figure in it. And he couldn't read it, but he saw this picture. And oh, he got excited and started thumping his index finger. He grabs me at my jacket and he's nodding vigorously. And I say, okay. And sure enough, we got everything all set up. He opens up his little suitcase, brings out his casts, and they're really washed out, but there they are. So there's the Titmus cast. There's his cast. And here, just for good measure, here's one other example of many that I could point to. This one from the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla, Washington, one of Paul Freeman's casts. Now here's the kicker. Here's the smoking gun, if you want a smoking gun. Yes, this was cast in 1967, but no one understood what this was. If you asked anybody, the common reaction was, well, it must have stepped on a branch. If you look at the photo, I didn't include a picture, there's some light twigs that are kind of sticking out of the sand, sort of adjacent to the footprint. And that planted the seed of an idea that there must be like a green bough that's half buried under that, from the flood action, half buried in the sand. And that this creature or whatever stepped on it, pressed that down with its weight, but then when the weight was released, it bounced back up, creating the hillock there, that speed bump. Okay, well that happened in how many tracks did you see red arrows of? At exactly the same position relative to the toes, same orientation, whoops, and not only all those other tracks, but somebody in China, goodness, sorry. Somebody in China somehow faked a foot that looks almost identical, just a little more robust than Patty's footprint with the pressure ridge in the same place at the same orientation. And look at this, because when I saw this one, it was a little more pronounced, so it drew my attention to it. You notice that kind of double hump right there? Like a sideways McDonald's golden arches? That's the point of the head of the navicular, or the head of the talus and navicular, and the cuboid. And there it is right there, and there it is right there. Now so I first published my description. Uh-oh, what did I do? Oh, I lost it. Let me go back up here. I first published this in 1999. Mr. Yuan cast this in 1995. This was cast in what does that say, 91? 1991. Where did they get their inspiration? Where did they get the instruction manual for fabricating a footprint that agreed with Dr. Meldrum's yet to be divined and published model of the Sasquatch foot? I mean, to say that all these tracks are nothing but spurious hoaxes and fabrications is just indefensible, entirely and utterly inconceivable. Here's one more nail in the argument, and that is if you go to the early hominin fossil record, which is what I do a lot of, you notice that you notice that these are the famous Laetoli footprints in East Africa that date to about 3.5 million years ago, and there's a pressure ridge, and it's repeated in multiple footprints. I tried to draw attention of my colleagues to this, and they say, "Oh, no, it's just an excavation artifact," and that Mary Leakey was kind of nearsighted, and she was chiseling away and got too aggressive and exfoliated too much and left that broken ridge there. Or it was, no, there's terrestrial termites that make burrows like gophers and went through here and raised up a little gopher mountain. And I said, well, independent termite colonies that intersected multiple feet at exactly the same point and same orientation. Well, and what's interesting is here's in light color, you can barely see perhaps, the reconstruction based on a composite of the skeletal elements of Australopithecus afarensis, and independently placed on by those researchers on this photograph. Well, look, when you mark the transverse tarsal joint in that skeletal reconstruction, where is it relative to the pressure ridge? It's in exactly the right place. And then this was the real clincher for me. This has never been described or published. It was a cast that was in the possession of Dr. Tim White at UC Berkeley, and I went down there and examined it along with a lot of other artifacts. But you can see I've lined it up. It's a little bit hard to tell, but here's the footprint. This is not part of the footprint. That's just a glob of ash that came down like a mud ball, plop right there. But there's the deepest impression of the big toe and the deep impression of the heel right there. And then right there is what we call an extrusion artifact, not just a ridge that's humped up, but the material was a little bit wetter there, so it actually squished out and folded over like a little wave. And I'm confident that it's not an excavation artifact, it's not an exfoliation artifact, because if in some examples where material has squished up, extruded between the toes, and then when the foot was gone, fallen over like a crest, it looks exactly, has the same rounded edge. And you can actually see a secondary little extrusion artifact that corresponds to the position of the heads of the metatarsals right through there. That in this flat, flexible foot, which is now accepted as the conventional wisdom about early hominin foot morphology. What I've been arguing for Sasquatch, now these are not just little human feet walking on arched feet, but they are flat, flexible feet that retain that more primitive characteristics. Okay, I'm going to put it on here, double light speed here. Terra Amata, Homo erectus, 400,000 years ago. Boom, another pressure ridge right across, right, no, that's not going to work, right across where the red arrow is. All right, so let's go on. Deep jaws with a flat face. Now here, this struck me. One time, you know, there are two models that I entertain for at least right now as working hypotheses, as null hypotheses to be further tested as to the origins of Sasquatch. One of them, originally suggested, was Gigantopithecus. Right size, right place, right time. But we have a very limited fossil record. We have a couple jaws and a few thousand isolated teeth. That's a few. Isolated teeth, no postcranials, no other elements of the skeleton below the neck to tell us how it stood or walked. But we have a lot of information about Paranthropus, but it's in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong size. But then the Hobbit was discovered. The Hobbit, which looks like a late Australopithecine or early Homo, something that was in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, it was in, we only know of them in Africa from 3 to 2 million years ago. And yet here it turns up less than 50,000 years ago in Southeast Asia. How did it get there? Well, if an Australopithecine from Africa could spread across southern Asia and end up as a relic population in the islands of Indonesia, why couldn't a robust Australopithecine also which existed in Africa up until about 800,000 years ago, migrate across Asia and along the way during the Pleistocene become gigantic like so many other megafauna of the ice ages did, and emigrate across the land bridge with 75% of the mammals that we consider endemic to North America, but actually originated in Asia. So here's the skull of Paranthropus, a line just scaled up to the same absolute size as the image of Patty, a close-up there. But what's striking is point for point, every landmark lines up perfectly with her skull. Every point. And the take-home message is, not in the details, but which are impressive alone, but in the overall gestalt, the overall image, which is this big, deep face and itty-bitty brain. Jaws that are massive, with huge premolars and molars and tiny canines that are flat to allow for more side-to-side grinding by these thickly enameled teeth with flat cusps, flat crowns with low cusps and few ridges. This is an adaptation for what we call durophagy, a diet that includes tough and hard objects in the diet. Now here you can see the two principal muscles involved in chewing, the largest of them. There are a couple others, but these are the principal ones, the most superficial. You can see a chimpanzee on the left and Paranthropus on the right there, second from the right. And let me move over here. Is that better? Get rid of that ringing, sorry. But look how the masseter and the temporalis is labeled there in the human have increased in size, even by comparison to a chimpanzee. And they're huge compared to a human. But look at that massive temporalis that fills that entire side of the head. And even more impressive when you look at it from this perspective. Look at that jug, we're looking down from the top of the skull. Notice the very narrow area behind the orbits and right there at the end of that red bar. But the red bar suggesting the depth of the temporalis muscle compared to that little thin sheet we have on the side of our head. I mean, that's just massive. Massive there. Now here are the teeth of Paranthropus. Paranthropus was, about average size, about 5'5", the males, and that's what the teeth look like if compared at correct scale, correct relative scale to one another, compared to the human. Look at the huge enlargement of the premolars. Up here, the premolars, and these 3 molars. I mean, not only are our teeth much smaller, but most of us don't even have our wisdom teeth anymore, right? Now, to make that more impressive still, let's put them side by side. Let's first Sasquatch size Paranthropus, take him up to 8.5 feet, and then compare it to the human skull. Whoop. Well, there you go. Now, here to make it even more impressive, I've highlighted in blue the biting area of just the premolars and molars of the Paranthropus relative to the human. I hope that's impressive. I hope that's impressive. This is not a human adaptation. It's a totally different strategy. It's a Cuisinart. It chews its way through the environment. It doesn't use tools, but it uses its teeth to grind and chew its way, to subsist. That's just totally a different adaptation. Now, to further impress upon you, if any of you have inclinations to that camp that gets preoccupied with the humanness versus the non-humanness of this creature, here's another little exercise, if this hasn't impressed you already. This is not just an 8-foot-tall human. This is an 8-foot-tall primate that has a completely different adaptation. One that's bereft of any material culture except for opportunistic wielding of sticks and stones. Okay? All right, so here's a little exercise. We have Patty, who we all acknowledge is a female, right? We'll let this go. This is Am Bam at the London Zoo, who has a real proclivity for walking bipedally and has been in the news recently. And then an example of Homo sapiens at some beach. She is wearing, those of you in the back, she is wearing a swimsuit. Barely, but she's wearing a swimsuit. Okay, now, gentlemen, if I were to attach a little device to track your gaze, it'd be very revealing to see where your line of sight was settling. And it would be no surprise because we're hardwired biologically and culturally to recognize a potential mate, right? Another individual that would be a suitable companion, a suitable mate. Okay, how long did your eyes linger on that, I cannot lie, I like big butts? How human does Patty look now? All right, so for you ladies, so I don't be accused of being a sexist, and in the name of gender equality, for your benefit, Am Bam's starting to look pretty good, huh? Now, there's some interesting other revealing information here. I mean, look at the back folds. Bill Munz and I did a really fascinating paper just on the adipose tissue, on the skin and superficial fascia of Patty. But just this configuration, notice how the back folds are bilaterally symmetrical there. And look at that, right there. Even Am Bam's got it. You look at a costume, and when you get a fold that's visible like that, it goes all the way across the back. Because it's not bilaterally symmetrical, unless there's been some device to tack it down to an undergarment tightly against the skin down the spine. But that looks and behaves just like real skin. All right, so in fairness to the ladies, here you go. Not better? All right. So human, no, it's not a human. It's not a human. It's not, they're forest people in the most generic sense of the word people. Okay, non-projecting canines in the absence of tools. Real quickly, this is not so. But here, Ramapithecus was thought to be an early ancestor of humans. Why? Because it had these itty-bitty canines. And remember this argument about tool use and brains and bipedalism? Well, the only reason to have short canines is because you're wielding a stone tool, right? That was the thought back then. in the 30s and even up and through the 60s. And so if you have short canines, you must be using tools. If you have tools, you have to have free hands. If you have free hands, you're walking bipedal, right? So based on that fragmentary fossil, reconstructions of Ramapithecus, just the jaws, reconstructions of Ramapithecus looked like this back in the 60s and 70s. We now know that short canines are part of the adaptation of increased enamel thickness, which requires more side-to-side chewing to fully affect the grinding action afforded by those thick, flat, bulbous teeth. So now, Ramapithecus looks like this in the textbooks. All right, so here you can see the projecting canines restrict the bite pretty much to just open and close because of those interlocking projecting crowns. Whereas over here, with the crowns shortened, the jaws can grind in a side-to-side fashion, or a combination, a circular fashion, much more effectively. All right, and of course, you know, why would Paddy be described over, not Paddy, but Sasquatch? You know, almost all credible reports where the teeth are observable, or observed, they're remarked as being squared off like a human. No, you know, long, intimidating canine teeth, but rather a flat dentition. And in fact, you know, what would have been the inspiration for Paddy in 1967? One of the most popular, if not the most popular, monster on the silver screen was King Kong, which was based loosely on a gorilla with a projecting face, canine teeth, very distinct and different from the depiction of Paddy with a flat face. Absolutely flat face, jaws tucked back under, and with a massive masseter and temporalis evident. All right, now Paranthropus, we've been using as this model, as this analogy. This is interesting. Again, look at the timing. Yes, it was discovered clear back in 1959, at least the skull, the first jaw in 1964. But as you know, it's getting better, but there was always a long lag time between discovery and publication and description. And so the first doctoral thesis that actually looked at the biomechanics, the adaptations of this flat face, this unexpectedly flat face, because before it was thought that the face only got flat as the jaws and teeth got smaller, not as an adaptation for enlarged hypertrophied jaws. So this was very unexpected. And it took a long time for, you know, the students to get their minds wrapped around it. This was 1983. The first symposium that really looked at the overall adaptations of this parallel lineage, Paranthropus, was published in 2007. Again, Sasquatch predating, anticipating in these ways. Now, some of you may have seen the documentary where we produced a skeleton of Sasquatch. Well, here it is. Make a long story short. We modeled it after composite of Neanderthal as a representative robust hominid as a starting point. So we get a digital skeleton into the computer, and then we could stretch it like Gumby. We could stretch it and lengthen it and widen it, and we used as our model Paddy for the proportions rather than just, you know, make something up as a straw man. We used Paddy, and we substituted for the Neanderthal skull the skull of Paranthropus. And it was really quite fascinating. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is one feature, unfortunately didn't make it in the documentary, but that immediately came to my attention and was all too evident. How many have heard this as a witness? It didn't have a neck. No neck. Well, it has to have a neck. There has to be 7 cervical vertebrae. So why would they say there's no neck? Well, Dr. Krantz had argued that it had to do with a more ape-like configuration with the shoulders up high. Our shoulders have dropped down quite low, and gorillas and chimps, for example, and orangs have shoulders that are much higher on their thorax, on the rib cage. But that doesn't really work that well in this case. But what does is if you take that Paranthropus-like skull with an itty-bitty brain and these big, deep jaws and put it on a spine, what happens? It covers up the vertebrae from the side and the front view. You know, that lower jaw, it's almost resting on, you know, and there's obviously some room for give and take and margins of error in the inference of this reconstruction. But it's almost sitting on the clavicles there. Whereas with the human, you've got these itty-bitty jaws and this big bulbous head sitting on the skull, and a lot of it shows up, you know, pencil neck sticking out there. When you look at the position of the spine relative to the skull, in humans it's tucked way up underneath. So you've got this enlarged brain with greatly enlarged posteriorly, this much reduced base, so the head balances on this now centrally positioned opening for the spinal cord, whereas in great apes it comes in from behind, and it requires large muscles and a large area of attachment for those muscles of the neck to balance that head with that very heavy set of projecting jaws. Early Australopithecines, early bipedal hominins show an intermediate arrangement with a somewhat enlarged brain, a more vertical face, but because of the bipedalism, the spine is tucked up underneath quite a bit. Okay. So, I did it again. Okay. All right, so here, look at the attachment of the trapezius on this skull. Here, tucked in really small area of attachment. Okay, look at Patty. Look at the point of attachment of that trapezius. Kind of intermediate to the gorilla and the human here. And then if you consider the tremendously broad shoulders with that relatively high attachment and the muscles flaring out like a cape, I mean, look at it. Look at the size of that trapezius. It's massive. Like most costumes off the store shelf, you know, it's a big bulbous head on a pencil neck. Rarely do they even address the neck whatsoever. All right, now, I said that the film was in focus, and I fudged just a little bit because even though that was a fixed focal length lens, it was a cheaper lens that wasn't corrected for chromatic aberration. That means, as light went through the lens, it was refracted differentially. The different colors were refracted differentially. So instead of everything being focused in sharp focus on the film, as with a corrected lens, things are a little bit out of focus with different colors. Well, today we can digitize the film in the computer, split the color channels, and we can tell which of those colors is most in focus on the film platen. It's like the Claritin commercial, where they peel the film away and it suddenly becomes sharp and clear. All right, and so when we do that, it turns out that the red is most in focus. And so here, the red channel is isolated, the frame is stabilized and playing now at the proper film speed, which makes a big difference in the appearance of the gait and the moments of inertia of those massive limbs. But this is by far the most stunning representation of the film that you'll ever see. And unfortunately, you can get online and find a copy of this and look at it on your computer and see it much better. But you can start, we looked at the head, we looked at the feet, but there's details all down the back. You can see the shoulder blade moving. You can see the erector spinae because of that forward lean. They're very well developed. Those two columns of muscles. You can see the buttocks. You can see it contract at the proper time. You can see the rectus femoris muscle in the quads. You can see right there, right behind the knee. If you reach down behind, you can feel that guitar string, that tendon of the biceps femoris. You can't see things like that under foam padding and non-stretch fur cloth. When they had Chris, I just went back on his name, but he was a BBC producer, and he wanted to debunk the Patterson film, so he did a documentary attempting to do so, and they show him at one point with the actor, and he's watching the film on the monitor, and then he says, oh, that's obviously a man in a fur suit, and here's how we do it. And camera pans, and here's the actor donning the suit. He's pulling on a spandex undergarment with sewn-in foam musculature, and then he dons the four-way stretch fur. But because there are seams at the wrists and the ankles and the neck, the hair is about 6 inches long, hanging over it. Okay, wait a minute. 1967. There is no spandex. They were just experimenting with injected foam rubber. John Chambers got an Oscar for his work on the appliances used in the original Planet of the Apes movie. They didn't have four-way stretch fur. They had fur cloth, which is why you've got those folds running all the way across the body in unnatural patterns. 1967, remember, you got to keep the film. So, just a man in a fur suit? Well, there were those that would have you believe that. Bob Hieronymus and Philip Morris here, after 8 months reverse engineering one of Morris's off-the-shelf costumes, this is what they came up with. A furry Pillsbury Doughboy. I mean, look at the folds I'm talking about. You see him? Look at that straight leg. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous to suggest. So, finally, a telling test of a hypothesis is if it stands at odds with conventional wisdom of the time. Does it predict future knowledge? The Patterson Gimlin film anticipated several different significant aspects of current anthropological understanding of the hominins by decades, in multiple ways that Roger could never have even conceived of, let alone have the technologies to incorporate. So the end of the story? I don't think so.
Dr. Jeff Meldrum, right there.